Welcome back to Business Ethics. My name's Tom, and in this unit, we are going to get into the topic of culture, corporate culture in particular. So, in general, we can talk about this idea of organizational culture, right? Culture, just how it emerges. There's just norms, values, behaviors um, that are kind of taken on by a particular organization, right? And you can talk about this in terms of, a nonprofit organization or government or all kinds of different entities, sports teams, all kinds of things like this. Corporate culture is pretty simply just one kind of particular facet of this, right? We have a particular kind of organization that is a business. In this class, we're talking about for-profit businesses mostly. Um, and so corporate culture signifies the norms and beliefs that kind of provide a certain standard of the way things are done at that corporation, right? Um, so importantly, culture should be distinguished from a mission statement or a code of conduct, right? Um, because the official mission statement or the official code of conduct of a company can be different from its actual culture, right? We've all seen this in different forms, right? Where a company, what they say they do is not what they actually do, right? Culture really has to do with more about what they actually do, right? Um, and so a lot of companies engage in a lot of important work in order to get their company and the people and their employees and everything else to align with the kind of code of conduct or mission statement that they have, right? And we'll talk about some of that work that they do. So first of all, why is culture so important? I think it's extremely important, and the reason why it's important is mostly because it's inescapable. If you put a group of people together, they're going to start behaving in a certain way. And the way they behave, each person behaves, is going to affect the way the other people will behave, right? There's just no getting around it, right? And everything you do kind of starts to form a culture, right? The values you emphasize, the actions you select or you focus on, how you talk to others, which parts of the code of conduct you actually do follow, which rules you actually respect, which managers you respect. Like you're just going to start to do these things in certain ways, right? And people will catch on, and certain behaviors will catch on, and certain behaviors will fall away, and a culture will just form. So if it's not tended to, it's going to likely go awry, right? so um, so again, so we have this idea between like a distinction here between an individual issue and a systemic issue. This is similar to what we talked about a little while ago with individual interests, organizational interests, right? It's a similar kind of juxtaposition here, but you know, when we're talking about issues here, we're talking about some kind of a problem, right? And an individual issue is a problem that's really specific and kind of isolated to the behavior of an individual, or maybe even a small group of individuals, right? So, with an individual issue, if you change out that person, right, you won't have that anymore. So you can imagine, a company, let's say it's a factory, and you keep getting problems in the line. You find out that one of the workers has been, using drugs pretty heavily, right? Although the way they're performing affects everyone. If you replace that person or get them in rehab and they clean up, right, that problem goes away, right? Um, you have kind of like a bad apple type problem, right? A systemic issue is different, right? A systemic issue has to do with an issue that if you did kind of replace those individuals or solve whatever issues those individuals has, you probably would not solve the problem, right? So, um, an example here is that is very much so a problem of culture, right? If you have a really bad culture, and you can have bad culture that results in high turnover, but that culture stays, right? You keep replacing people, but everyone kind of falls in line into these unhealthy norms, and so that's a systemic issue, right? It doesn't boil down to the choices of just particular individuals, right? Um, so I give a couple examples here of issues that are, or I give one example here, the idea of a privatized police force, which is um, uh, particularly should be viewed as a systemic issue, right? So in the United States, we have a public police force, right? It's a public good law enforcement. And there's good reason for this, right? It's put in place in this kind of systemic way because having a privatized police force is kind of inherently problematic, right? If law enforcement to in particular areas were owned by individuals, that person would be inherently above the law, right? And the law enforcement would not um, probably treat everyone equally, right? Um, it's kind of inherently corrupt to have a person kind of own the cops, so to speak, right? It's just a bad system. That would be a broken system. It would be broken at a systemic level, and it didn't matter who was the owner of the police, right? That person would always be above the law, right? And so this would be a systemic problem, and so we put in place certain structural um, uh, you know um, uh, policies so that the police and law enforcement remains a public good, right? Um, Conversely, this is not in my notes, but you can think of an example of something that needs to be kept privatized, which would be journalism, right? If journalism is all, state sanctioned, right? This gives rise to all kinds of problematic propaganda. Anything that the government doesn't like reporters to talk about would be kind of censored, even if it's only like implicitly. So we keep journalism private because of these kinds of systemic problems, right? And I think we're all familiar with one other example I want to mention is, COVID-19 is an inherently systemic issue, right? A pandemic and also vaccinations, all these kinds of things are systemic issues, right? Also, like restrictions on antibiotics and all kinds of stuff like this um, are systemic problems, right? I'm sure we've all heard people talk about the coronavirus and say, oh, well, I don't care if I get sick. Well, that's not really the issue, right? We've talked about flattening the curve. It doesn't matter if you get sick or if I get sick, it has to do with hospital capacity, right? And even if maybe you don't get sick or you get sick and it's not that bad, if the hospitals are flooded with people, then when you need to have a baby, you've got no place to go. If you have an accident, there's not enough EMTs to take care of you, right? These kinds of things. It becomes a systemic. I mean, it is a systemic thing, and you need to kind of view it at that systemic level, and that's how you attack it, right? And that's how you get policies and whatnot. And the same thing when it comes to corporate culture, right? If you have a cultural or a systemic problem at your business, you need to treat it as such, right? Replacing a couple of people is probably not going to help. Trying to enforce a couple of rules here or there is probably not going to help. You're going to have to change the mindset of the kind of core belief system or core practices of that of that business, right? And so that's why I really emphasize this idea of systemic problems. Um, so they mention a few different kinds of culture, and I'll just go over them really quickly. They talk about apathetic culture, which is, a culture where they just don't really care. They have minimal concern for people or for performance. A caring culture is one that has very high concern for people and how they feel and how they're doing, but like minimal concern for performance. Um, Exacting culture is one that's very concerned with performance and very unconcerned with people. And then the best is supposed to be integrative culture, which shows high concern for both performance and for people. And I do think that it's also a school of thought that is, if you take care of people, you get better performance, right? um but there's also business models where you don't really care about people. You just expect a lot out of them and you get high turnover, but you continue to, meet your goals and your bottom line. So, that's just kind of charting different approaches there. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here are when it comes to culture, you really have to think about social power and power structures. There's a lot you could say about this. Um, but um, when we talk about power in terms of like social power, we tend to think about it in terms of misuse of power. um, the idea of authority and being too authoritative and people being corrupt and abusing their power and things like this. But authority more generally um, just has to do with the way in which social structures function, right? You have a hierarchy in lots of social organizations, right? A parent has power over their child. A person takes on power of attorney when someone is invalid or can't make decisions for themselves, right? There are just more generic sense of authority, right? Um, and this also speaks to Thrasymachus and the idea of might is right and what role authority plays in ethics. That's something to think about, to recall. But here we're talking about just kind of power in a general sense, and they talk about kinds of power in the book, and they're not all bad, right? They can be bad, but they can also be good. They can also function as like a tool, right? So they talk about reward power, right? You influence behavior through rewards. Like that's not always bad. Giving people bonuses because they are high performing. You do have, as manager or middle management or a VP, you have that kind of power to allocate funds to set up these kind of rewards. But you might really view that as a tool, right? Of course, you could misuse that tool and give the wrong people the wrong kinds of rewards. I think with the Wells Fargo scandal of opening up accounts that they were doing it for bonuses, right? But the practice of giving bonuses, you might think in itself is not bad, right? Coercive power is the idea of influencing behavior through threats. Again, there's lots of ways in which coercion is really bad. Threats can be quite bad and can be a bad use of power. But also, if you ask someone in your office and you say, look, if you don't stop doing this behavior, or if you don't perform better, we're going to fire you, right? That's a kind of threat. That's not necessarily bad. It seems like, you're being a manager in that situation, right? I also talk about things like legitimate power. So this is uh, it's kind of the idea that you basically defer to some person in a position of authority because they are in a position of authority. Now, a lot of times this is can be very corrupt. That basically you do, it's kind of the "I told you so" or "because I said so" kind of authority. But um, also, there are social structures where this is very important, right? You have certain organizations that are very hierarchical for a reason, and the one that comes to mind is military, right? You have a chain of command. You do what your commanding officer says because they say it, and that's it. And there's a reason for this, right? You really need to be able to make decisions that affect a lot of people very, very quickly. Um, and you need this kind of like strict obedience here. Um, there's also expert power. This is an interesting one. And this has to do with the power that you have in terms of having expertise, right? You have specific knowledge about something, so people recognize you as an authority. Now, we tend to think that this is a good source of power, and oftentimes it is. It seems like you earned it. You became an expert in a particular area, but also this can be misused, right? Because if you are, I don't know, you're do like biomechanics or something in this very, very niche area, you could falsify your research or say things or interpret your research in a certain way, and people are going to defer to the way you think about this, but they don't really have a way to put a check on that because you are the expert. So it can be used to influence in a negative way, right? And then the last one is kind of an odd one. They talk about referent power. Um, and they say this is kind of leverage one has over another when they have a mutual goal. So the idea here is that, think about if you're doing like a group project um, in class or something like this, and you all want to get an A. As being part of that group, you have a certain kind of power over people who are also in that group to kind of motivate them to do things, right? You might delegate tasks for that project in a certain way, and when you hold other people in the group accountable for doing their part, you are using this kind of referent power. Like, hey, we both want to get an A. You should do this and I will do this, and we'll both win out, right? That's what they mean by, I don't know why they call it referent power. I guess it references that common goal when you're using that power. So anyways, those are some things to think about. Start to kind of like dice up the idea of authority and power and the way in which those notions of power can facilitate good, healthy or unhealthy culture, healthy or unhealthy group norms in your workplace, right? And so, depending on the kind of workplace, you might see more of these different kinds of power structured, right? You might see more reward power or coercive power, like say, I don't know, in sales, a sales firm or something like this. If you have, if you're doing something high end, kind of like engineering or something like this, you might have more expert power going on where you have to delegate tasks a lot. You might have more referent power if you have a firm where lots of people are doing um, working together on projects where they have to work together, and so on and so forth. So this helps you kind of identify possible problems or possible solutions when it comes to culture. So that's it for today. I will be talking with you soon.